Good evening, everyone. It's your favorite up-and-coming maritime historian here, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Titanic miniseries, which came out in 2012, and just kind of go over some of the good things and the bad things that I saw, and some of the historical inaccuracies, among other things. But there's a lot that Julian Fellows did get right in this, and I want to talk about that. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to start on episode 2. I will go back to episode 1 at some point, but I want to start episode 2 because chronologically, as far as the story of Titanic is concerned, it is the earliest because it starts in Belfast. So we'll go ahead and start there. I have to adjust my audio a little bit here. It records my speakers, but it does not. It's difficult sometimes capturing the audio through your headphones, so I'll adjust it a little bit.
Why is it taking so long? Who's working on the wiring?
Jim Maloney.
Maloney. He's a Catholic.
He's our best man.
You don't have to look so offended. I hire Catholics. As you well know, I'm jeered at in the street for it. No, he can be the Pope's nephew as far as I'm concerned. But if he doesn't get this bloody wiring finished in the next 10 days, we're going to miss the bloody trials.
Steady on, Uncle Bill. Deep breath.
Okay, so a bit of historical context here for those who don't know. In 1912, Ireland is in the middle of a very decisive move. The Catholics want Ireland to become its own country. The Protestants want to remain under British rule. And this causes a lot of nasty, nasty fights that continue even well after the formation of Northern Ireland in 1913. And it continues all the way up into the 1990s and early 2000s. So this is just the kind of the beginning of this very divisive period in Ireland's history. And Lord Peary was one of the few wealthy members of the gentry who would actually hire Catholics. And he was picked on for it by his peers. And he was also harassed in the streets, and he even received death threats, and a couple of people attempted to assassinate him over it. He was actually forced to leave Belfast just before this, actually. This is late March, early April 1912. So they said there's about 10 days before the trials, and the trials took place at the beginning of April. So we're about mid-March here at this point, and Peary is about to be forced out of Belfast because of the people jeering at him in the streets. And he does not come back. He does not see Titanic again. So that part is accurate. Andrews here, as you can see on the left, he is Lord Peary's nephew. He's his sister's son. And he has been groomed at this point to take over the company, Harland and Wolff, eventually. At this point, pretty much his whole life. He started at the bottom as an apprentice, working by putting rivets into the hull of the ship when he was 13. So he's been doing this now for quite a long time, for decades. And Andrews was absolutely loved by everybody in the yard because of the fact that he actually came up through the ranks. He didn't use his class status to just get to the top. He actually started at the bottom, and he worked his way up. And he understood the men, and he knew the men, and he worked with the men, not against them. He was a wonderful example of how a good leader should act. And at some point, I probably will make a video on historical leadership with using Thomas Andrews as one example. So let's go ahead and continue here.
We'll never need lifeboats for every passenger. They're ferries, isn't it? If liners sink at all, they take a very long time about it. More than enough.
Okay. I have to go out here and say this because this is a huge pet peeve of mine when it comes to Titanic films. I understand why they do it, and I'm not picking on Julian Fellows or anybody who made this series because they did a phenomenal job with this. It's definitely a worthy tribute in time for the 100th anniversary. But the amount of times that I see references to lifeboats in Titanic fiction is just ridiculous. At this point, they are about ready to sail. The last talk about lifeboats occurred in 1911 when Carlyle, who was the original chief designer of the Olympic class, remember Titanic is an Olympic class liner, she's the second of the three. Carlyle was the one who originally designed Olympic and Titanic, and he designed her with the davits that are capable of holding up to 64 boats. But it did not end up that way. And it was actually Carlyle and not Thomas Andrews who pushed for the lifeboat issue, and he eventually just walked away in disgust. I mean, he just had enough. And that was back at the end of 1911. So by this point, Thomas Andrews was not going to push this issue. He'd already seen Carlyle resign over it at this point, basically got forced out and then just walked away. So Anders is not going to push this issue that much, if he is at all. And also, they're getting ready to sail. They got like a week before the sea trials at this point. So there is no way that they're talking about this at this point. I understand why they're doing it. It's good foreshadowing. But at this point, I just feel like it's really kind of cliche.
More than enough for other boats to reach them.
Exactly. When Republic sank, 6 people were killed in the collision, but everyone else had been transferred to another vessel before the ship went down.
Okay, so this is actually very important to discuss because this is exactly the mindset that people had at the time. Republic was the last major liner to sink before Titanic, and that was in 1903, so 9 years before. And she had been the victim of an at-sea collision, and she stayed afloat for 3 days. She actually was being attempted to be towed into port when she actually sank, but everyone had long since gotten off. And so the mindset was that liners take such a long time to sink that they won't go down before plenty of ships reach them, and therefore their lifeboats are meant to be ferries and nothing more. And the idea of putting more lifeboats up on the top deck, not only would it ruin the view, but it also might frighten the ladies. So in that they might have thought that maybe the ship isn't that safe if it has this many lifeboats. So that was the belief at the time. I still think that the scene talking about lifeboats at this point is cliche. I don't agree with it. I know why they did it, but I don't agree with it. It's stupid, in my opinion, and I'm sick and tired of seeing it in Titanic films. But there's nothing I can do about it, unfortunately. Wish there was.
How a man like that gets to be head of the White Star Line is a mystery to me.
Not an impenetrable one. His father owned the company.
Okay, that was good. Actually, that was good. Not dissing on Ismay here at all. I'm not an Ismay basher. Okay, but I'll put that aside for a moment. So Thomas Ismay was Bruce Ismay's father. J. Bruce Ismay. That's his full name. So Thomas Ismay founded White Star in the mid 1800s, and he was very prominent businessman, and he basically built the company from the ground up. I hate it when this thing does that. Ignore the white screen. It's just loading. It does that when I pause it for too long and I have this recording. Don't worry about it. So, anyways, Thomas Esme died in 1899. The second Oceanic, RMS Oceanic of 1899, was the last ship that was launched. And interestingly enough, she was going to have a sister ship called the Olympic, but she got scrapped. Olympic got scrapped before she was ever launched, and it was another 12 years before another Olympic was given that name for White Star. That Olympic, of course, being Titanic's older sister and class namesake.
A Murdoch means that a ship as famous as Titanic is an obvious target, sir.
Gentlemen, all White Star ships carry guns, and I don't believe a bomb would do sufficient damage to take us down. But I'm afraid that's all I can say to reassure you. Life is a risk every day that passes. The truth is, man might sink us, even if nature can't.
Okay. I like this line, man might sink us even if nature can't, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it just captures the attitude of this time period so well. I mean, my God, it captures it so well. The understanding was bigger is better, and the bigger a ship was, the safer it was. Titanic was the largest ship ever built up until that time. Period. Largest moving object ever made. It's like if the tower in Dubai could sail. I mean, it's phenomenal. It's absolutely incredible when you think about it. And big meant safety at that time. We got to remember that even though at this point that they're in the Edwardian era, there's still very much a Victorian era mindset that's still there. It lingered for quite a long time, and it probably would have lingered well beyond 1914 if World War I had not interrupted it. But that'll be a different video. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this quote so beautifully captures this mindset just so well. It's not true, of course, as we all know. Spoiler alert, sorry. But it just does such a good job of capturing this belief that whatever you make, especially if it's big, if it's strong, if it's reasonably fast. Remember, Titanic was not designed to break records here, but 22 knots is not slow. And it's just this belief that the bigger something is, the safer it is, and this is the biggest ship in the world, therefore she's invincible, she's unsinkable. And that quote just so brilliantly illustrates that. A couple other things as well while I'm at it here. Captain Smith here, I've seen so many different versions of him in different Titanic films. It's not even funny. I absolutely love this one. This is actually probably one of my favorites. The second one, of course, being Bernard Hill in 1997 Titanic, Cameron's Titanic. A couple things stand out to me right away. The beard looks accurate for the most part. I'm not a huge fan of the somewhat balding head, but I mean it looks good. The mustache is good. The eyes. Sometimes you have actors who play Captain Smith who are brown-eyed, and Captain Smith himself was actually blue-eyed, and this actually looks accurate. He looks like he's got blue eyes as well. His uniform is correct as well as the two other officers here. You can see Murdoch right here, and then Lightoller back here. That's correct. It's very well done. This scene is very, very well done, and I'm very happy that they included this in here. And I know my beautiful face is blocking the wording there, but it just says April 9th, 1912, Southampton. So it's the day before sailing. One thing I just love about this. Now, this is obviously, of course, CGI, but it's actually more difficult than you might think to get this image because the scale is not necessarily always easy to capture. You can get, with some tweaking, a good size of the ship, but the way that they did this, when you see Light Taller walking up the ramp, and I'll go back to that again here and look at that really quick. Let's look at that again. Look at that. Look at that scale. You can see that right there. You look at that scale. You get 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 rows of portholes, and then you get up to the upper decks. This is the whole line right here, and then you've got the superstructure. 1, 2, and then you got, looks like these are the buildings here. And this is based on the real life image, of course, that we all know of. Actually, it's Olympic, but pretty similar, as we all know as well. They were basically twin ships. And you can see here the size of this. I mean, just look at the size here, this deck here. This right here is at least 15 feet. And you can see that it's over twice the height of what he is. He when he gets up to the ramp here, right about here, he'll be about up to about here roughly. So about half of the height, something like that. So we're looking at probably about 12 to 15 feet between this line and this line. And it's so well done. This angle, the scale, everything on this image, even though it's CGI, it's very well done. It does a beautiful job of capturing the scale, the sheer scale of Titanic. I mean, look at that. Honestly, if you were a Victorian who was living in the Edwardian era, who'd grown up in the Victorian era and lived on into the Edwardian era at the turn of the 20th century, I mean, looking at that, I mean, you would think that that wasn't going anywhere, right?
I'm afraid I don't quite understand.
You're being very slow, Mr. Lightoller.
The company has decided that Mr. Wilde will replace Mr. Murdoch as chief officer. Mr. Murdoch will become first officer, and you will become second.
But sir, we've already allocated the duties between us. I mean, should we unravel all that when we're sailing in a few hours?
May I say something, sir? As you know, I've served as chief to Captain Smith in Titanic's sister ship, Olympic. There's little difference between them, and I believe it would be useful to have a captain and a chief who really know how the ship works.
First of all, thank you for mentioning Olympic in this. Thank you. Second off, I love you, Julian Fellows, for having Chief Wilde in this. I wish she was seen more.
So what happens now, sir? Does Davy Blair replace Pittman, Boxall low, and so on?
Okay, so they're going to talk about this here in a minute, but I'm not going to go ahead and record that. But Blair leaves the ship. As exactly as Captain Smith said, it's a last-minute deal. They're sailing in a few hours, and Blair is replaced as third officer. And this has very interesting consequences because Blair has the keys for the binoculars for the crow's nest. And when he leaves, he carries them with him in his suitcase. Personally, I would love to know if those keys actually ever turned up eventually. But anyways, because of the fact that then they don't have the binoculars for the crow's nest, there's a debate about this still. I'm on the side that the binoculars would not have made a difference whether Titanic hit the iceberg or not, because binoculars were not meant to spot things, they were meant to clarify things. So the naked eye was actually your best tool as a lookout, and to some extent to this day it still is, but the binoculars were just there to basically tell you what is this object. It wasn't there for it wasn't there for discovering objects. You would have already discovered the object with your naked eye, and then you would have brought the binoculars to your eyes to then figure out, is it a ship? Is it an iceberg? Is it a deadhead, which is another term for a floating log? I mean, is it debris? What is this that I'm seeing? But you would have already seen it with the naked eye, whether you had binoculars or not. So it wouldn't have made a difference. That's the side that I take on that. If you disagree with me, that's totally fine. You're entitled to your opinion, but I'm just stating mine here.
Charming.
Oh, no.
I love you, Blair. Honestly, Jenna Louise Coleman is gonna have that baby face until she's 50. I swear. She just is ageless. I love her.
Places in second and third.
You should watch her in Victoria too, even though she's well known now, of course, for being in Doctor Who. Her performance in Victoria is just
Annie Desmond, sir.
And your position?
Cabin stewardess in second class, sir. And to look after the dining room for the servants of the first class passengers.
Who will all be quite as difficult as the flyers.
that's not for me to say, sir. Forever a classic. I love her.
So here we are, packed in the steerage with the sweepings of the streets of the city.
Just a grump.
Don't be such a grump. It's not so bad, and it's not for long.
Wait.
Oh yeah, sure. Pick the child up. That's gonna help. So steerage, it gets a bad reputation, but actually the steerage on Titanic and other White Star Line ships was actually better than the steerage on pretty much any other ship with any other line on the North Atlantic at this time. White Star, the advertisements that we often see nowadays are for the first and second class, and they really exhibit the luxury of these large ships. But in reality, Titanic was an immigrant ship. Third class is where she made her money. And so the lines all had a vested interest in the well being and the appropriate care for these passengers. And White Star had a reputation of being the best in terms of service for the third class passengers, which is why more third class passengers started flocking to them about the same time. Cunard may have had the blue ribbon and would have gotten the third class people there to New York faster, but White Star would have gotten them there in style. There are many accounts of third class passengers on other White Star ships, such as the Adriatic and even Titanic's sister ship Olympic, during this time, that these people are absolutely astonished at the luxury of their accommodations. They've got electricity. They have 3 square meals a day. Some of these people would actually even bring their own silverware because they weren't even sure if they would even have silverware there, and they're eating off of not quite fine china, but to them it's practically fine china. Um, it's the most to them it's the most luxurious thing that they're ever gonna get. And so I just want to kind of break that myth up a little bit, and I'll be doing that probably continuously throughout this series. The idea that third class was somehow considered as the lowest class of citizens. It's not really the case. From a business standpoint, these people are the most important. From a publicity standpoint, first class is. But from a business standpoint, economics wise, this is where the money is, and a lot of effort went into ensuring that these people were well cared for on their journey across the ocean.
Fix it.
Thank you.
I can see the chemistry between these two right off the bat, and I just love it. It's not Titanic if there's not a love story. I mean, come on. But it did actually happen in reality. It wasn't super common, but it did happen. There's a reason why this kind of story is told, and it didn't start with James Cameron, okay? Cameron didn't invent this trope by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm kind of reluctant to call it a trope just because of the fact that it that these love matches did occur on ocean liners. Sometimes they were actually great places, especially for the wealthy who had eligible children to basically play matchmaker. And you know, what better environment? You're all stuck on a ship. It's not like the kids can just wander off and rebel, you know? So it definitely did happen, probably more often than most of us historians might realize. So it's not really a trope. It's a little bit of a stereotype, and I say it's a stereotype because it really just is in film and in fiction. It's really portrayed more as just pertaining to Titanic. So I would call that more or less a stereotype. But for ocean liners in general, this definitely did happen. And absolutely it happened amongst crews as well. It still happens. Hookups happen amongst crews, even on cruise ships today. It's forbidden, but that almost seems to be an encouragement for people. just as it was back then. Things haven't changed much.
I must get on. I should not be in first class anyway. You're a bad influence.
You are a bad influence.
You can't come with me.
I can try.
I love these CG shots of the ship. I just do. I'm going to be showing all of them as often as I can. So this is an Anglican service that's being shown here. The boat drill that was scheduled for this time, and I don't know why exactly they scheduled the boat drill for the exact same time that the church service was going to happen, because it would have been canceled anyway. At that point, the captain's not going to not lead the Anglican service. It's basically pretty much in his job description at this point. Captains in this time period, and even to an extent today, are publicity managers for their vessels and for their lines. And Captain Smith was very well known as being an expert at this, to the extent that some passengers would actually change their bookings to ships that he was commanding so they could sail with him. He was adored by everybody. And he was the highest paid captain on the North Atlantic as well, which speaks not only to his customer service ability, but also his seamanship ability as well. He had not been in any serious accidents up until 1911, so over 30 years at sea, and he had never had a serious accident. Depending upon your viewpoint, I don't even believe that the Olympic collision was his fault. That was, in my opinion, completely Hawke's fault, but I will get into that in another video. And so up until this point, I mean, he's loved by pretty much everybody. So it makes perfect sense that he's going to lead the Anglican service, and he's not going to allow a little boat drill to get in his way for that. Nowadays, it's up until 2012, it was required that within the first 24 hours of leaving port, a ship had to have a lifeboat drill. After the Costa Concordia, which occurred only a few months shy of the 100th anniversary of Titanic, it occurred about the same time this was actually being released, the rule was changed that to before the ship leaves port, a boat drill has to be carried out. So the rules, of course, have changed in the years since, but that's sometimes the beauty of disasters. They aren't pretty, but good things do come out of them, and the biggest one, of course, is new rules, safer rules and regulations. And Titanic was definitely the epitome of that, which, yet again, is going to be another video. I'm making a list. If I forget, just write it down in the comment section below of all the times that I say this is going to be a new video. So I'll remember how many new videos I'm going to need to make.
What are you doing here?
I was curious, I wanted to look.
Let's not make any trouble.
So, church services were the only time that anyone on the ship, whether they're first class, second class, or third class, could go to these services. It didn't matter if you're a third class passenger and the service, this one, like this one, which is in the first class part of the ship, it doesn't matter if you're third class or not, you could actually go to first class to attend these services. No one was prohibited on the ship from attending church.
Did you make a first class?
Very elegant. I'm sure it will be. Once the colours have settled down.
Is there anything else?
Good night.
Good night, Madam.
Well, let's just hope there was no one we know in the saloon. Because I wouldn't want any witnesses to that exhibition of grovelling. Surprised you've any stomach left after crawling on it for most of the afternoon.
I was being polite. It was kind of Lord Manton to invite us.
And we know why he was so kind.
He wanted to show his gratitude to someone who's worked for him with duty and discretion.
Discretion, I grant you.
What are you talking about?
About a young lady in Leafy Dodge who doesn't know that she's the bastard daughter of the Earl of Manton, thanks to the ever so discreet John Batley, Esquire.
So having a wife and a mistress was very commonplace during this time period. It was common during the later half of the Victorian era, and it really became popular at the turn of the 20th century. By the Edwardian era, it was not only considered acceptable for first class society to engage in this behavior, it was actually encouraged. And the only stipulation was just make certain that the wife and the mistress never meet. So she's complaining about how the Earl of Manson, who's a fictional character, by the way, she's complaining about how the Earl had this child out of wedlock, and well, it's unusual, it's not unheard of, and again, having a mistress if you're a wealthy earl was a no-brainer. It was pretty much acceptable. The wife would expect it, but she would be also expected to turn a blind eye as long as the husband was not blatant about it, which it sounds like that's what's going on here because the earl has directed Mr. Batley here to take care of this matter privately, keep it out of the public eye, which is exactly what you're supposed to do if you're a first class guy. But if you're wealthy, you can pretty much do anything you want. I'm not saying it's right, I'm saying it happened.
Officer, I wish you would explain the company policy. We have Madame Obard, who I gather is almost a woman of the streets.
Well, everyone has a right to cross the Atlantic.
But not in first class. And what about that frightful Mrs. Brown? It's bad enough to put up with the rudeness of people like the Wardenners, but why should we have to suffer Mrs. Brown? She shrieks like a panicking mule, yet last night she had the captain at her table. I'm sure he looked at me.
The husband's face. Oh, God. So, Grace Rushton is a wealthy first class lady. She's a self made woman. She and her husband were businessmen, and they basically came not entirely from nothing, but kind of middle class to upper class to wealthy. And she just has this attitude of trying to forget her background. And the bit where she's getting after Lightoller about Mrs. Brown, absolutely correct. Margaret Brown is an exceptionally wealthy, she's actually one of the wealthiest people in the world at this point. She actually did come from nothing. Her husband, who stays at home in Leadville, Colorado, that's where they're from, he's not a social guy, he's a miner, and he struck it really rich in gold while digging for silver. It was one of the biggest gold veins ever discovered in the United States. It rivaled even the gold vein that saw the California gold rush. That's how big it was. So that's why Mrs. Brown is extremely wealthy. She's a socialite. Her husband really isn't. Her husband is happy to remain blue collar for the rest of his life. She's not. She wants to get out and see the world. And she, probably because of her background and because she wasn't, trained in the proper etiquette, so to speak, she's not afraid to speak her mind. She's a very outspoken woman. She's strong-willed. She's stubborn. There's a reason she earns the nickname the Unsinkable Molly Brown after this. She is so far ahead of her time, it's not even funny. If there's anyone from the Titanic that I would love to sit down with and have a cup of tea with, it would be Margaret Brown. She is just so progressive for the time period, it's not even funny. She would fit in so well nowadays, but for 1912, she's really out there. And people really ostracize her for that. They ostracize her because of her background and because of her mannerisms. She just doesn't fit in. She's the outcast, despite her wealth. They can't ignore her because she is really rich. But at the same time, they don't always like to put up with her. And this is a perfect example of that. I'm gonna go back again because I've got just this horrible freaking love for these CGI images of Titanic. I just love them. Absolutely love them. They're just I can't get enough of them. Every time I see that, it's beautiful.
To suffer Mrs. Brown, she shrieks like a panicking mule. Yet last night, she had the captain at her table. I'm sure he looked at me as if he was suffering, but
And the husband's face, he's just like 100% done with this. He's like, I wish I could control my wife, but I can't. He's just along for the ride. I imagine that's the face my own husband gives when I'm not looking. She really was a beautiful ship. Absolutely just gorgeous.
We never race. Let Cunard collect the blue ribbon.
Well, I wasn't talking about racing, just making up a little time. At that rate, we could arrive half a day earlier.
White Star offers reliability and luxury second to none. That's enough. A few hours here or there will make no difference. I can hear my bed calling. Good night, gentlemen.
Good night. Well, we'll see about that. I have never seen such a clear sky or a calmer sea. I think we can make a little headway without frightening the horses.
We have had some ice warnings, sir, from various ships in the area.
Well, our course is well south of the ice field.
Can't find the binoculars. Does anyone know where Davy put them?
We'll send out a search party in the morning.
Well, that's it for me. I'll take a tour, then turn in. I meant what I said. You'll let me know of any changes.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here in this scene. And this is probably going to be the last one for this episode. I'll do some more on the other episodes as I go along. So, to start off with, the beginning of the scene was taken from Ismay's testimony. Ismay said that he did not push Captain Smith to steam Titanic faster than she should have been going. And they make a mention here of the blue ribbon. That's historically inaccurate. Titanic could not get the blue ribbon even if she tried. Okay? Her top speed, we don't actually know what it was because she never got there. We know what Olympic's top speed was, but Titanic had thus far proven to be slightly faster than her. Olympic's top speed was about 23, 24 knots. Titanic might have been able to push 25 if she was lucky. At this time in 1912, Mauritania had the blue riband. Mauritania's top speed was 27.5, 28 knots. There is no way that Titanic is going to get the blue riband. If she pulled a Carpathia, which is shut off all of the heat to the hot water and all that, and direct every ounce of steam into the engines, she might have been able to push 25, maybe 26 knots, but there's no way she's getting the blue riband. It's never going to happen. It never did happen. The last time White Star had the blue riband was before the turn of the century. So that bit is very inaccurate. Secondly, there is debated evidence about who ordered Titanic to continue for full speed. Obviously, as the captain, the final decision does come down to Captain Smith, but at the same time, the fact that the owner of the line is on board is going to affect the captain's judgment. And it's interesting they don't show this scene in any of the episodes as far as I'm aware of. They do show it in Cameron's film and quite a few other ones, so that's interesting. But the scene I'm talking about is when Ismay and Captain Smith are together in the dining room, and Smith is talking about wanting to slow down because he's been getting some of these ice messages. Keep in mind, he never did get all of them. That last crucial one from the Coronia that said that there was ice directly in Titanic's path, never got to him. Even so, with the ones that he got, he did actually delay his turn to the west, so it's called turning the corner. When you go across the North Atlantic, even today on the North Atlantic shipping routes, you go kind of in a southwest direction from Europe until you hit about 350, 400 miles from Canada, and then you turn due west if you're going into New York, because that's just the way that the routes work. Smith delayed that turn by another 10 miles. And what that did is that took Titanic even further to the south. And he did that because of the warnings that he had already gotten, that he knew about the ice field that would have been in Titanic's path if she had turned the corner, as it made that jog to the west, as the route would normally dictate. Instead, he took her 10 miles further south before making that turn. If he had known about the ice field that was much further south than anyone had expected at this point, he likely would have slowed down, but he did not know this. Also, at this time, the belief was firm in the ability of a ship's lookout. If you have clear visibility, you did not slow down, especially if you are a commercial passenger liner captain. If you are a cargo vessel, different story. But if you are a passenger liner, your job is to get your people from point A to point B as fast as possible. That is your job. That is your only job. That is what you're there to do. And woe be it to you if you don't do that. So, Captain Smith is not doing anything different than any other captain on the North Atlantic at this time. He is doing exactly what he's been trained to do. He's doing exactly what everyone else has been doing and does do up until this point, and to extent continues to do for quite a long time. It takes a long time before before everything really starts changing. And so he's, in his mind, he's got clear visibility. He can see out for 20 miles. The lookouts who are, over 100 feet up in the air can see out for 20 miles. So, and he's got clear visibility. There's not a cloud in the sky. There's no fog, no haze. And so, in his mind, if there's any danger ahead, I'm going to see it long before I get there. So, that's why he decided not to slow down. If there was ice, they were going to see it in time. That was what was understood at the time. Of course, they did not take into account the atmospheric phenomenons that were happening that were once in centuries sort of situation. Cold water mirages we understand today. In 1912, they didn't really understand those. We understand them now to an extent, but back then they would not have fully understood what those were. The haze that Lookout Fred Hayes reported, that was the effect from the drop in temperature, the sudden drop in temperature from entering the Labrador Current from the Gulf Stream, that the horizon was basically lifted up. That's what it looked like. It wasn't actually lifted up, but the visual effect was that it had been. And that's what hid the iceberg from view until it was too late. If Titanic had slowed down, I don't think it would have made much of a difference, if any difference, if she'd hit it or not. Because part of a ship's maneuverability comes down to how fast they're going. And the more water that's flowing over the rudders, the better the ship's going to turn. So if the Titanic slowed down, her turning ability would have sucked. And she probably would have still hit the iceberg even if she was going 10, 12 knots. But I'll talk more about that when we get to episode 4, which deals with the iceberg collision directly. Rather than this episode. This episode is more of a preview. I'm going to do episode 1 next, just continuing that chronological order here. So, I'll go ahead and get that going here in a few minutes. I'm going to close this video out, and then I'm going to pull up the next one, and I'll see you all in a little bit.